We are here today to discuss Maurice Siegel's 2022 book, Towards a Unified Psychoanalytic Theory, Foundation in a Revised and Expanded Ego Psychology, that just came out in Italian with the publisher Raffaello Cortina of Milan. Nancy McWilliams will discuss with Maurice Siegel and ask him some questions about the importance of this book and in the current landscape of psychoanalysis. First, I want to say a few words on Maurice Siegel and Nancy McWilliams for those who don't know them well. Maurice Siegel is an important researcher and author who published several books, some of them translated into Italian. I briefly mention his authored books. I do not list his edited books because it would be too long. The first one was Recent Developments in Psychoanalysis, a Critical Evaluation of 1984. Then From Classical to Contemporary Psychoanalysis, a Critique and Integration, 2011. Translated into Italian, this one too. Attachment and Psychoanalysis, Theory, Research and Clinical Implications, 2013. This was translated too. The two-volume set, Core Concept in Psychoanalysis, Clinical Research, Evidence and Conceptual Critique. The first one on classical psychoanalysis and the second one on contemporary psychoanalysis. These two books came out in 2018. Then Towards a Unified Psychoanalytic Theory, Foundation in a Revised and Expanded Ego Psychology, which is the book that we discussed today. And finally, a book just wrote, Subjective Experience, Its Fate in Psychology, Psychoanalysis and Philosophy of Mind, which will appear in a few months. Eagle is also in the editorial board of the Italian journal Psicoterapia e Scienze Umane, in English is Psychotherapy and the Human Sciences, where since the early 1990s published several articles, and also in issue number 2 of year 2021, he wrote a paper in which he summarized the book we're discussing today, that he also presented in a seminar to our group in Italy. Eagle received his PhD in psychology at New York University, NYU, where he was a student of George S. Klein, and subsequently he became part of the NYU Research Center of Mental Health, directed by Robert Holt and George Klein, where he participated to the seminars given by David Rappaport. In 1972, he moved to the Department of Psychology of York University in Toronto, Canada. Then in 1995, he went back to New York at Adelphi University, where he is Professor Emeritus. In 2004, he moved to Los Angeles. Among other things, he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, President of the Division of Psychoanalysis of the American Psychological Association, recipient of the Bowlby Ainsworth Award in 2005, etc. Morris is a psychoanalyst who has always been interested in empirical research, and in fact, the Italian area group of the Society for Psychotherapy Research, SPR, will pay close attention to this book that, like other books, contain important empirical data. I spoke with Vittorio Lingiardi, who is the president of the SPR Italy, and he told me they will discuss this book and they will talk a lot about it. Now, Nancy McWilliams. Also, Nancy teaches at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology of Rutledge University in New Jersey. And also Nancy is very well known in Italy, since her books are widely read and also used as textbooks for university courses in psychology and psychiatry. I mentioned some of her books that have been translated into Italian. Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, Understanding Personality Structure in the Clinical Process of 1994. Psychoanalytic Case Formulation, 1999. The publisher here is the same one of the book that we discussed of Morris today. Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, Practitioner's Guide, of 2004, and Psychoanalytic Supervision, 2021. With Stanley Greenspan and Robert Wallerstein, she co-edited the PDM, Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, in 2006. This was translated too. And with Vittorio Ringiardi, the second edition, the PDM2, 2017. And now they are working at the third edition, PDM3. Nancy is honorary member of so many associations and received so many awards that it will be really impossible to mention them all here. Among them, for example, she was president of the Division of Psychoanalysis of the American Psychological Association. I do not want to take too much time from this webinar, and I prefer to give space to them. So I ask Nancy to say a few words of introduction and to ask some questions to Morris.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I am really looking forward to a conversation with Morris, whom I have known now for many, many years. I'd forgotten we'd both been president of the Division of Psychoanalysis in the past. I had the pleasure of reviewing this book for psychoanalytic psychology, so I read it quite carefully. And as always, I was tremendously impressed with the incisiveness of Morris's mind and capacity to understand the implications of research, the limitations of research, the relevance of research to major psychoanalytic issues. And I feel very much positive about his effort to bring back an ego-psychological orientation as a unifying orientation to the general field of psychoanalysis. Not entirely a popular position. I would say the relational movement is very dominant, and some relational analysts, but not all, feel that there is a kind of inherent tension with ego psychology. But I think that is our best hope for integrating research, practice, and different sub-orientations within the field. I think a lot of people agree with me. Peter Fonagy and Glenn Gabbard and Jerome Wakefield all gave ringing endorsements to this book. And it also won a prize, I believe, from the American Academy of Psychoanalysis and Psychodynamic Psychiatry, was it? I think.
Psychology, yeah.
Psychology. So it's a groundbreaking book. It reminds me a bit of the book by Weinberger and Stolcheva in that it is integrative, it is research-based, it is thoughtful, it is not grinding a particular axe, as we would say in an American metaphor. And it tries to both raise questions and resolve differences of. I think I had pretty much finished what I wanted to say as an orienting set of statements. So let me start out by asking the question that Paolo was interested in exploring, namely, what do you hope for from this book, now translated into Italian, given the current landscape of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychology and mental health generally?
I hadn't thought of that question. It's a good one. I just want to say before I address that question that I'm honored to have a Nancy McWilliams as someone who's discussing and asking questions about my book. So I really mean that. Thank you for that, Nancy, for taking the time.
My pleasure.
For that. You know, I'm not sure that this may sound like an odd answer, but I'm not sure I have any hopes for the book.
Too much of a realist.
Right, exactly. It's just there. If it's anyone who wants to read it, given the current climate of psychoanalysis, as you point out, I think it would be much more fantasy than reality to expect that it will have a major impact. However, I've always felt, and I do about this book, that if simply a number of people who I regard highly, of course, you amongst them, Nancy, if they find the book interesting and worthwhile, that's really quite good enough. And I don't have any fantasy that somehow it's going to have a major impact and so on. And so I don't know, that's not an inspiring answer, but it's an
No, but
honest.
it's a kind of thing that I would expect from you, namely speaking what you see as the truth.
Thank you.
And standing for what makes sense to you, irrespective of what is, politically, socially, or in other ways, sort of trendy.
Yeah. In fact, as I think we would all agree, the trajectory, the direction of psychoanalysis is quite different than anything than is one represented by the book. All you have to do is look at some of the journals, well, not all of them. I think psychoanalytic psychology has really done an excellent job under the editorship of Chris Christian. But,
yes, and before him, Elliot Jurist.
And before him, Elliot Jurist. But some of the other psychoanalytic journals, although I shouldn't say this, I'm on the advisory board of JAPA. Some of the recent articles are involved with issues such as mental telepathy, often the politicization of psychoanalysis. I don't think we want to get into that. So those are entirely different directions than one that's represented by the book. I think you would agree, wouldn't you?
I would agree. I did a very interesting panel with Joyce Slockauer at the Valencia, Spain meetings of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, in which she argued that we are not fighting with each other as much anymore, that the conflicts between interpersonal and self-psychological and relational and object relational, Lacanian, Kleinian, different teams has calmed down a lot in the field. And I think she may be right about that. She wrote a very nice paper called "Are We Nicer Now?" But I do think there are stresses within the field that are different, and some of them are the political issues that we won't go into, but they have to do more with generational differences, I think, than which team you're signed up with in terms of theoretical differences. So I think in one way, your book comes along at a very good time when people are interested in integration, not just within psychoanalysis, of trying to think about different theories as different angles of vision on something rather than true false narratives, but also between psychoanalysis and cognitive behavioral therapy or the humanistic tradition. We have, the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration and other movements that are trying to bring some order out of the chaos, the babble of all these different, not just technical approaches, but paradigmatic assumptions that different approaches make.
That's interesting.
And I do think the argument needed to be made that you made in the book.
That's it. I hadn't thought of the point that you made that Joyce Schlockauer refers to, but that seems to be true. It's also true in clinical work. analysts no longer are frightened of talking about using various approaches and techniques
Yeah.
that would normally be associated with the other school. In
Yeah.
fact, they're often proud of integrating different technical approaches that in the past have belonged to this or that school. So I think that's true. You know, I just, this issue of integration is an interesting one. I wanted to say something about that, and I hope it's not lost in the book. Yes, one of the purposes, one of the aims of the book was to try to demonstrate that a revised and expanded ego psychology is the best bet for integration. And by the way, I want to make that clear. It's not because it's ego psychology versus the other approaches, but it's because the belief that ego psychology is best suited to integrate object relational perspective, drive perspective with the four psychologies of Fred Pine mentions, and self-psychology. So it's not a matter of one dominating the other. It's a matter of taking the position that of the four psychologies, that is mainly ego psychology, that is the best bet for integration. And if it was simply the ego psychology of Hartman and Rappaport, that would not be the case. That's why I think it's important to recognize that it's a revised and expanded ego psychology.
Yes.
The other point I want to make is not only is it a revised and expanded ego psychology, but this is, I think, something that often gets lost, and it sort of comes in a way at the very end of the book. You know, in the original German, the ego psychology is Ich psychology, namely I psychology. Interesting. Just thought that popped into mind. George McCarry, in one of his books, doesn't use the term ego psychology. It's almost like an affectation, but it's not. He says, repeatedly, I psychology. And I think that's a good thing to have done, because what Glenn Gabbard in his endorsement calls an appreciation of my emphasizing, quote, the personal element, is, I think, quite important about why ego psychology. It's the one psychoanalytic approach, interestingly enough, even in terms of the very language, that refers both to ego functions, which is sort of a more, objective third person approach, and at the same time refers to the I, the personal element. And it's the integration of the two that I think is quite important. So the point I want to make is, despite all the talk about it, subjectivity and intersubjectivity and the personal, the irony is that of all these psychoanalytic approaches, the I psychology is the best bet for recognizing the personal element, the center of one's existence, the subjective experience, which of course then gets picked up in the next book, where that's the focus. So I hope I've made that clear.
I think you did. I hope that readers can follow that. So many people have a distorted image of ego psychology, or such a narrow version of it that they don't realize that. I mean, that's why it's good that in the title you say revised and expanded ego psychology. I'm curious about something in that respect. I know Otto Kernberg has made the argument that an object relations perspective should be the encompassing theoretical paradigm. And I know that you spoke to his group a few months ago
think I
shortly
did, yeah.
after your book came out. And
Mhm.
I wondered how that conversation went. I mean, one of the things that you say is that the ego psychology movement inadequately integrated object relational issues, and that would be part of the revised expandedness that you're interested in. How did
Mhm.
it go when you were talking with people who want to use object relations theory as the basis?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, that didn't come up. I remember
Huh,
Otto Kernberg saying, I agree with what you're saying."
okay.
So maybe he was just being uh, gentlemanly and so on. But
No,
he
he
did,
doesn't do that. He
I know
disagrees when he disagrees.
he speaks his
I mean,
mind.
it's not ad hominem. I mean, he enjoys
Yes,
disagreement with people he very much likes. But
yeah,
I would
that's
guess
true.
that you were in some way speaking the same language.
That's yeah, but you're quite right. They it's we don't converge on that issue
Yeah,
of, obviously I think object relations is profoundly important, but you don't have you're not capable of object relations or interpersonal relations without being a person, without an
yeah.
I. So it seems to me that there's something far more fundamental about um, the personal element, or at least it precedes the capacity for object relation. Now I know that I'm not denying the fact that becoming an I is totally requires the other, the connection to begin with. However, my own position, which is closer to um, I'm blocking on her name, who defines intersubjectivity as two subjectivities in interaction. Nancy
Ah,
Charro. It's Nancy
yeah,
Charro,
yeah.
rather than somehow as if object relations implies some kind of a fusion, that a third that somehow emerges from the two individuals interacting. So the point I'm making here is that I think fundamental to even object relations is the capacity to become an I, and that I would view object relations as one of the ego functions. In fact, in the book, I talk about interpersonal reality testing. It's so interesting that Freud's concept of reality testing has to do largely, in fact, almost exclusively, with the ability to test a kind of basically external reality. The beginning, his first uh, example of that is the baby hallucinates the breast. It becomes clear that it's not going to satisfy the hunger drive, so it has to turn to the object in reality. That's a sort of his prototypic example of reality testing. However, it's sort of ironic that insofar as psychoanalysis is supposed to be concerned primarily with psychic reality, there's relatively little said about interpersonal reality testing. And by that, I mean my ability to understand what you're saying, how you feel, what you're intending. So in that sense, it's an equal function. It's
So you're talking about what Fonagy would call mentalization
ex
there, right?
exactly. In effect, that's a good, yeah, precisely what you say. But on a very fundamental level, not necessarily as a deliberative one,
Hmm.
but also, for example, the 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 information we have regarding, let's say, mirror neurons,
Hmm.
uh, a kind of subpersonal automatic um, simulation and bodily understanding of what you're saying or intending. Um, Even at the level of a monkey, remember the serendipitous finding was one ape or monkey observing another one grasping something, and then lo and behold, the same area of the brain that's involved in the grasping is involved, also gets activated in the observer. I mean, that's actually an extraordinary finding. So the interpersonal reality testing has a fundamental biological basis, not only on mirror neurons, but other functions. So there is no conflict or tension between a focus on object relations and an ego psychology approach, as I understand ego psychology. And I hope I've made that clear, that it's an ego, interpersonal reality testing is an ego function, not just reality testing of the physical world, which is Freud's emphasis.
Yeah. You know, I had forgotten until Paolo's introduction that you were a student of Robert Holt.
Yes.
And it strikes me that you are very much temperamentally in his line. If what I remember from an early reading of my own of his work is accurate, if I'm remembering it accurately, I remember that he said that if you read Freud with the intent to debunk what he said, you'll find that just about everything he said was wrong. But if you read him with the intent to understand and think about things, he's extremely valuable. And in a way, you've lived out that sensibility of being able to question everything, hold it up to relevant empirical data, evaluate it, give back something a little bit different. And I'm struck how in the book you keep doing that with different major concepts that affect clinical work in quite an elegant way. I wonder how much you have paid attention to integrating the work of the neuropsychoanalysts like Mark Solms and Jaak Panksepp in this vision.
That's a good, interesting question. That's picked up more in the new book, by the way. The original title was going to be subjective. I'm not good with titles, but they can put you to sleep if you're an insomniac.
I'm not either, if you'll think about mine. Pretty dry.
The original title was going to be Subjective Experience, Its Fate in Psychology, Psychoanalysis, Neuroscience, and Philosophy of Mind. That was just too long. And I got rid of the neuroscience because most of the philosophers of mind rely on neuroscientific findings and interpret them. So I thought that. But before I address that question, I wanted to mention, actually, Paolo was in on that Zoom meeting. A few months ago, we had a Zoom meeting with Bob Holt, who is now 100 and, Paolo, is it 105 or 106? 106.
106.
Incredible. Now, he has no more short-term memory, but he is the Bob Holt we've known. He somehow retains that core. He said to me in one of our conversations, "You're ready for this?" about his loss of any short-term memory. He says, well, this is a man who's now 105, 106. He says, well, everyone makes a big deal of living in the moment. Well, I'm living in the moment now. That's an extraordinary, isn't that? It's so moving. And
yes.
Isn't that incredible? That's Bob Holt.
Yeah.
Okay, so I couldn't resist sharing that with you. With regard to the neuroscientific findings, it's really interesting. what can I say? Again, I don't want to sound too ornery and too much of a kind of too negative. I'm not, well, I'm sort of censoring myself before I speak. Many of the neuroscientific findings these days, forget about psychoanalysis for the moment. Many of the neuroscientists interpret neuroscientific findings to support a reductionistic and what in philosophy is called eliminative materialism. For example, and I quote this in the new book, Francis Crick, who, the Nobel laureate.
Crick and Watson, yeah.
Yeah, wrote a book some years ago called The Astonishing Hypothesis. And what's the astonishing hypothesis? This is virtually a quote. All our joys and sorrows are nothing but assemblies of neural cells. So a new book by, what's his name? Sapolsky, called Determination. It's attempted to demonstrate that there's no such thing as free will or willing having any causal powers, as Jerry would put it. Sam Harris's book on free will. So the dominant, or at least a dominant approach these days, is to take neuroscientific findings and to support the position that we are essentially nothing but machines, neural machines.
It's certainly a kind of reductionistic version of psychic determinism.
Exactly. Now, so in not even psychic determinism. Basically, there is no psychic.
There is no psychic.
We're
yeah.
essentially robots. Now, in a way, one can say there is no I.
Mhm.
There is no ego. They're just programs. And the thing here are now we come back to psychoanalysis. I also wanted to say, and this is the part I was censoring, but I decided to lift the censorship, which shows that repression can be voluntary. That the journal Neuropsychoanalysis, after all, that's good, the prototypic example of neuroscience and psychoanalysis. And many of the papers in it that I've read are basically have the same message. Look, Freud was right all along. And neuroscience shows that.
Yeah.
That's not science. That's endorsement. And if you really want to contribute, it seems to me, to psychoanalytic theory by appeal to neuroscience, challenge basic hypotheses. It's what I call the distinction between true scientific investigation and demonstrational research. Look, I was right, and that's one of the things I think is really bad about current research and so-called hypothesis testing rather than investigating. So I see that as a problem regarding the relationship.
Well, I get how you get that tilt to it, but at the same time, some of those people who are irritated that Freud's ideas weren't taken seriously and are trying to get them taken seriously in the context of contemporary neuroscience don't think that he got everything right. I mean, Mark Soames will critique, for example, Freud's theory of repression, because when you're under enough traumatic stress, glucocorticoids shut down the hippocampus. So it's not as if memories are repressed. They were never laid down as episodic memory. So
Mhm.
he will, some of them do critique Freud more than their tone implies. But I
Mhm.
know what you mean. You don't
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to start a
Well,
movement
yeah.
saying, gee, our founder was right all along and we'll
Mhm.
prove it to you.
Right. I think you're right, and I appreciate your tempering my ornery self. uh, but by the way, it's so interesting that you talk about the repression never occurred in the new book, not the ego book. One of the conclusions I reach about repression, with using the language of cognitive psychology, which I think is another area of integration,
Yeah,
possible integration,
yeah.
is repression is a matter of encoding, not retrieval. That's one way of summing up in psychological language what you just referred to in neuroscience in
Interesting.
neural language. Yeah. In other, I don't know if that's clear. I could try to make it clearer.
Give me an example, just so I'm sure I'm
Right.
understanding that.
Yeah, actually, and it's even there in Freud himself, but he doesn't follow it up. Uh, when he talks about unconscious emotion, Freud does. He says, well, clearly there's no such thing. You can't not feel, you can't not feel a feeling. By definition, it's it's conscious. There's no such thing as an unconscious emotion, but we can use it clinically, etc. So what could it mean? And then what he goes on to say, here are the possible meanings it could have that are not simply oxymorons. The motion is prevented from developing, or it's mislabeled.
Uh,
And so that's very similar to the kinds of formulations that presented by someone like Donnell Stern
I was just thinking of that. Yes.
on
Unformulated
not
affect.
formulating further, or Fingeret, a philosopher who talks about
Yeah.
not spelling out.
Yeah.
So what all this points to is you're not repressing a fully formed desire.
Right.
You don't allow it to develop at all, or you mislabel it, or you, as Freud said, you detach the idea from the affect and displace it onto something else. So those are the kinds of, it seems to me, careful analysis which are critical but respectful of Freud's
Yeah.
formulations that you referred to before. So
So by not encoded, you mean like
not encoding fully,
you get aroused. You don't encode it as anger, even though most people would.
or you don't allow
You can't formulate it.
you can't formulate it further. You don't allow it to be formulated further. You
Uh-huh.
don't spell out. But here's an example that Sartre uses. By the way, Fingeret was influenced by Sartre, who criticized Freud's repression hypothesis because it was it was made into a subpersonal mechanism rather than a person doing things. That was Sartre's criticism. So here's his famous example. A woman is having lunch with a man, a married woman, in a restaurant, and he takes her hand and holds it in his hands, and she doesn't do anything. She lets it stand there, lets it stay there. And after a while, he's encouraged by that, so he openly uh, tries to seduce her. And she's outraged. How dare you? I'm a married woman. And Sartre's point is she was already complicit in the seduction
Mm.
and didn't spell out her own project of what she was doing. So she didn't encode, so to speak, the meaning of leaving her hand in
Yes.
his and the degree to which that would be a compliance.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, Paolo mentioned George Klein. I remember George Klein's, I don't remember where he says it, but it's really a very important point that he makes. He essentially redefines repression as not making connections among different experiences, each one of which may be fully conscious. It's not spelling
So
out the meaning and the personal significance of these connections. Those are reformulations of fundamental concepts that certainly are
that's
not
closer
sure.
to dissociation as it's used by most people now.
Yes, but it doesn't require necessarily a dissociative state. It could be part of
Right,
normal
right,
functioning
right.
where you just don't make the connection between A and B and recognize the personal significance of that. So those are the sorts of reformulations of Freudian concepts that I think are clinically astute and very valuable. And I'd like to see more of that rather than he was right all along. That's the point
Right,
I'm making.
right. I agree.
Yeah.
Um,
There was something, oh yeah, I wanted to say something else that is in the book, in the ego book, getting back to that after all, what we're supposed to be talking about. You know, um, there are at least two Freuds. There's nothing original in this. There was the Freud during the period of the so-called id psychology, focus on the id. And then there's the Freud, who's clearly the father of ego psychology. It isn't Hartman, it's Freud.
mhm.
Begins with the ego and the id,
Yeah,
probably before, but at least then. So uh, the, the Freud of ego psychology, what does he say about the ego and its relationship to consciousness? He says the ego, consciousness is attached to the ego. We focus on the unconscious functions of ego psychology because of the emphasis on defense.
mhm,
And that led to the structural model. Oh, wait,
mhm.
it can't be just unconscious, conscious. The ego, part of the ego function is unconscious. Therefore, we have to focus not on quality of conscious, unconscious, but structures. Ego
Mhm.
is, but one of the ego functions, the way Freud puts it, is affects. The seat of affects is in the ego.
Yeah.
Uh, the 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 ego consciousness is attached to the ego. So because so much emphasis has been put on ego as the unconscious functions of the ego, we've lost sight of the fact, it seems to me, that Freud himself recognized that the ego is also the I, who's
Yeah,
of consciousness, and the I
yes,
experiences affects.
yes.
And that seems to me as an important reading of Freud that I tried to develop in the book.
Yeah,
And
I'm glad that you did that because there is very often a narrowing of the idea of ego psychology to what are you defended against that's not conscious, as
right.
opposed to what is your full subjective experience.
Mm-hmm. Um, I keep finding myself wanting to. Oh, I just wanted to, before I say that, um, you know who? Let's see if I have it right. Yeah, this is. I'm reading a passage from Jerry Wakefield's endorsement, and
Ah,
he gets right to the point of partly what we're discussing. He writes, "Ego psychology offers the dynamic center at which different psychoanalytic perspectives meet in forming human experience." And I
yeah,
think that sums it up beautifully. And that's really, uh, in a way, why I think ego psychology is the best bet for integration, not simply because it can integrate insights from other schools, and not simply because it's best suited to integrate empirical findings, but also, as Jerry puts it, it offers a dynamic center at which different perspectives meet in forming human experience. And what's the dynamic center? My alive, conscious experience, subjective experience. And So, one of the in the essay review of Jerry's book, one of the points I try to make is I think that psychoanalysis, at least Freudian theory, should be its definition should be changed from the Laplanche and
Pontalis?
my guy.
Pontali.
What?
Laplanche and
Pontali.
Pontalis, from the Laplanche and Pontalis definition of study of unconscious processes to the study of the relation between unconscious and conscious processes.
Yes.
I think that is more accurate a definition
Yes.
of psychoanalysis. So in a way, I'm glad we're stressing that, because I think that Freud was so involved in establishing, and this is what I'm working on in the review of Jerry's book, Freud was so involved in establishing psychology and therefore psychoanalysis as a science that it was imperative to not have psychoanalysis be the study of conscious experience, because, as he said, that was too mysterious to form the basis for a scientific psychology. Psychoanalysis had to be concerned with the same, quote, natural processes that exist, that are of which we have knowledge and which are stressed in all other sciences. So consciousness had to be viewed essentially as an epiphenomenon. And that's the philosophical Freud that Jerry so brilliantly describes. But there's also the clinical Freud. And he can't sustain that position when he's talking about people, about patients.
Yes.
So the clinical Freud suddenly, what happened? On the one hand, consciousness has no causal powers. It's merely the perception of unconscious processes. And then he talks about the goal of psychoanalysis is to give the ego greater freedom to choose and decide and avoid the repetition.
Yeah.
There are two Freuds here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I hadn't thought of it this way, but it seems to me that our best hope for combining and integrating those two Freuds is an ego psychology perspective, precisely because it has one foot in unconscious processes and one foot in consciousness and I.
Yeah.
And so I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but I kind of like that idea. So,
well, one of the things that I think we would both like to see is more research that's actually valuable for clinical practice. And I'm curious what kinds of areas you would like to see more research in, even given the fact that psychoanalytic academics are getting rarer in the field of psychology.
That's true. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you asked that question. And I say that because I take that up in the new book. We're talking as much about the new book as this book. First of all, I want to make a general statement that we are kind of moralistic and chide clinicians, and I'm sure I've done that too, because they're not interested in research, and they don't form themselves research finding, which might have an impact on their clinical work. We're all very good at showing.
It's a common complaint of researchers, though. I don't think it's always been fair. Yeah.
However, in my older days, age, we're getting a little bit more wisdom. They're not altogether wrong for ignoring much of research. I mean, that may sound shocking, but why? For two reasons. One, at least two reasons. One, much research that, including psychotherapy research, which should be most directly relevant, presents group findings. And when the clinician says, well, okay, what about a single, I don't know, that's well and good.
Yeah, my patient isn't on the middle of the bell curve. I
Right,
have an
exactly.
outlier.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like saying the average family has 2.5 children. That half a child, poor child. Okay. Now, I think the clinician can't get away with it altogether. They should at least use those group findings as a background of information,
Yeah.
not as a direct implication. Okay. But the other problem, the other reason I think clinicians have that's legitimate is very often, this is probably less true in psychotherapy research, but in much research, there is the problem of ecological validity.
Yeah.
Namely generalization to real life situations.
Yeah.
One of my old teachers, Kurt Goldstein, go way back, referred to the artificiality of, we are so preoccupied with research design, which is certainly experimental design, which in certain areas is extremely important, I agree, that we minimize the issue of ecological validity. This is all well and fine in its design, but does it have any implications for real life? And often the answer is no, or at least questionable.
Yeah.
Now, I think
Yeah.
there are remedies to that, but the responsibility for enacting those remedies seems to me lies in the hands of the researchers, not the clinician. Because so that I just wanted to make that point. Now,
Yeah.
it has implications, I think, for answering your question. I think we need to do, and even someone like Alan Kasdan, who's a dyed-in-the-wool researcher, wrote a terrific article on arbitrary metrics. It's called, like, these crazy assumptions we make, that if you, on the BDI, the Beck Depression Inventory, if you scored 24 and after therapy you scored 10, that somehow this necessarily has great ecological meaning is silly.
Yeah.
The scale, we respond to the scale as if it had psychological meaning. Maybe it does, but it needs to be thought through. Anyway, he himself talks about we need more N of 1 studies.
Yeah.
We need more disciplined case studies. And by the way, here's the clinicians are wrong.
Yeah.
There have been hardly, all there are clinical vignettes to support the writer's point of view in a typical article. There are no real disciplined case studies. And Dave Walitsky and I wrote a paper in which we try to outline what a disciplined case study should look like. So, but getting back to your question, I give some examples of precisely that in the new book. And by the way, the best neuroscientific findings that are relevant to clinical work are very simple. Despite all the talk about we're nothing but assemblies of neural cells, what Crick goes on to say in the very same page is talk about the neural correlates of this and that state. If we're nothing but neural cells, what are they correlates of?
What are they correlating with?
Correlates of experience and actions and so on. Anyway, the best neuroscientists seem to me at this stage really study the neural correlates of highly significant psychological and social phenomena. And that's good enough. They're not solving the mind-body problem. They're doing important. Let me give you one example, which may seem, what does it have to do psychoanalysis? But it does. I hope I get it right. Well, this may sound bizarre, but the study is of suicide among Indian farmers in rural areas in India. Okay?
Okay.
What do they find? now this isn't a neuroscientific finding, but I think it indirectly addresses the issue, and I'll get to that afterward, that suicidal ideation and action isn't explained by the size of the plot of land that they own. It isn't accounted for, hardly any variant counts for any variance of their debt. What does it, what predicts the suicidal ideation and action among these rural farmers who are living very difficult lives? How they deal with the stress they do have. If the dominant coping method is resentment, fantasies of revenge, etc., that's a predictor. If the coping method is more trying to help others, etc., it totally predicts a negative prediction of suicidal ideation, etc. Now, in other words, it's the psychic reaction and psychic appraisal of the condition they're in that is the best predictor of suicidal ideation. And what's my point here? What is this? How could you then say that we're nothing but an assembly of neural cells?
Yeah.
It would be like trying to make weather predictions by talking about atoms and molecules. Obviously, there's a question of levels of phenomena. So I think that also applies to neuroscience, neuroscientific research, namely, what are the correlates of very significant psychological experiences and actions that we can shed that shed light on why you have one set of feelings versus another, or one set of decisions or coping methods than another. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Well,
think
I'm interested in the example. I'm thinking of some of the clinical implications there. It means that if you have a person that you're worried about suiciding, your emphasis might not want to be on how resentful they are, but more where they can find meaning in their lives, other people to help, how they can make the most of what is possible rather than being resentful for what isn't. So it would be a matter of expanding affective capacity that
and
instance.
directing
So
outward towards it. Well, by the way,
yeah.
another example of that, I also dived into research you talk about of meaning of life and longevity as well as illness.
Uh-huh.
There's a robust body of
Yeah.
research on that,
Yeah.
and something as seemingly effervescent of meaning of life is amazingly predictive of illness and longevity. So the and something like me, this is a pitch for back to the book. Where do you fit something like meaning of life? Do you fit it into drive theory, object relations? Object relations may affect meaning of life. Self may affect, but it's so profoundly an ego function, or it belongs to the I.
Yes. Yes.
I
Yes.
feel my life is meaningful, and so on. And I think psychoanalysis would do well, this is, to get more involved in finding links to something like that body of research, meaning of life. This is a nice example, by the way, of something like Viktor Frankl, who you all the popular book. Lo and behold, it can be it can be the basic message can be researched.
Yes.
And it applies not just to concentration camp survival, but to survival in general. I think psychoanalysis would do a lot better in getting more involved in those sets of findings and how to view them psychoanalytically than this, you probably totally unnecessary, than pretending that being a little bit less arrogant, thinking it could solve problems of social injustice and racism. Be able to be competent where it really can be competent. Anyway, so I think those are some areas of research that I think should be attended to by psychoanalysts and could be integrated into perhaps psychoanalytic theory. And that does.
Thank you for that. I find myself thinking of one of my patients who has been depressed and who is starting to say, I need to find my purpose. And
Right.
I do know about that research about meaningfulness and its correlation with longevity. And
Yeah.
instead of, interpreting that as some kind of fantasy, I say, yeah,
No.
that's right.
There's a problem with that, though, Nancy, that is interesting. And I do discuss this in a paper I wrote years ago called Interests as Object Relations, which is my favorite paper. It's the one I really, really believe is true.
Interests as object relations. I haven't read that.
Yeah. The point I make there is it's all well and good to say I need to find meaning.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the seeming paradox. It's a little bit like Zeno's paradox. Finding meaning has to be intrinsically motivated, not as a means to an end. If it's a means to an end, it loses its power. It would be like the American comedian W.C. Fields, the comic, the famous, whose cure for insomnia was try to get a lot of sleep. So,
right.
So the
cure of depression is cheer up, right?
Right. So the paradox is how to find meaning without linking it to, I need to find meaning for me to feel better.
Right. No,
Once you
I
do
think
that, game over. It ain't gonna work.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge we face, it seems to me, because finding meaning is an intrinsic expression of who you are. Now, this is where the psychoanalytic part. So if you're going to find meaning, you have to change who you are. It's one way of looking at it. And you how do you become someone who is capable of intrinsic motivation, who is capable of being interested in something for its own sake?
Well, we have a lot of clinical experience with this. For example, the patient I'm thinking of found great meaning as long as she was bringing up children who weren't fully grown. And now she does have to change who she is. And it will involve her whole subjective experience of what her life is going to be about from now
Who
on.
she is.
And of course, we all make men who retire from jobs that have consumed them and defined their meaning. They have to go through this process too. So I think the kinds of things that you're talking about here are highly relevant to almost all clinical experiences. How do we adapt to change?
Yeah, I think so. It's like that same paradox comes up, I think, and also in the analytic relationship. For example, Bowlby writes, I think basically he's correct, that the therapist should serve as a secure base from which the patient can engage in internal exploration.
Right.
Such a wonderful summary.
Yeah.
Of just what you would want to define what a therapeutic relationship is about. And however, here's the paradox. How do I get to experience you as a secure base?
Yeah.
Given transference and given, which really means that I experience you as an earlier figure in many respects, how do I get to experience you as a secure base? And that, in a way, becomes a significant issue in the entire therapy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And is transference analysis I think it's relevant analysis of the transference? Yes, it's relevant, but it's not enough. So a point of view that I have found very helpful in that helps with that paradox is the control mastery theory of Weiss and Sampson.
Yes, I like their
I have to, I can't say I'm a secure base for you. I don't know you.
Right.
I met you.
No, you're going to test me, and I have to try to pass the test.
I have to prove it.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part of therapy also that we often overlook. It isn't just analysis of the trend. You tell me that I'm reacting to you as if I were your father. I could take it or leave it.
Yeah.
Or, put up or shut up would be the alternative to that. Show me that or what Schaeffer calls earned authority. I like that. You have to earn your authority, not just assume that it exists.
I always assumed that the analysis of the transference was ultimately to demonstrate that you are different from the transference.
I know, but that's not going to be accomplished by saying you're reacting to me as if you were your father.
True.
Maybe I am reacting. Maybe I'm behaving like your father.
Right.
That's why you react to me that way. So that's a whole other issue. But that's actually, in a way, I don't want to stretch too far, but that also seems to me something that an ego psychology perspective would be relevant to.
Yeah.
I forget who said this, but some wise clinician said your interpretation should be limited to what the ego can assimilate.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, the transference analysis should fit that model too. So, okay, I think I've talked too much, but
well, we're reaching the end of our time, but I wonder, is there anything you would want to say that we haven't had a chance to cover here?
Yeah, let's see. I wanted to say one thing occurs to me that one of Hartman's contributions, and I think this is a positive one, not, trouble with Hartman is reading him is impossible. That actually is a good cure for insomnia, is picking up a Hartman book if you can't fall asleep. But the adaptive point of view, he says, not just the different perspectives, but psychoanalysis needs to include an adaptive perspective also. And that's been interpreted as adapting to conforming to societal demands. That's been one of the criticisms. Oh, it's just asking us to adapt to. It's such a misreading of what adaptation means, particularly in an evolutionary context. And Hartman was very much aware of evolutionary theory. He meant it, and it means it doesn't mean conformity at all. In fact, for many of us, the best way of adapting would be to protest, to be non-conforming. So I wanted to. That's been a very unfair criticism of ego psychology, of Hartman's ego psychology. So I guess that's it.
Well, thank you. I'm glad your book is being translated into Italian.
So am I.
Italian colleagues can have the benefit of your incisive thought. And I wish you well with the new book.
Thank you, Nancy, for doing this. I really appreciate it. I know you're busy and have other things to do. So
yeah, but you're fun to talk to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paolo.
I thank you both. To me, your discussion was extremely interesting, really. I liked
Really?
very much also the fact that at one point you did not talk about the book we were supposed to talk about, but you let yourself go to say whatever was coming to your mind, which is
Okay,
very
okay.
beautiful because everything is connected
Yeah.
in psychoanalysis. So I like that very much. It was very free, the discussion, and
Okay. Wait a while. When you say everything is connected, are you a conspiracy theorist?
yes.
Okay,
And,
thank you, Paolo.
so thank you very much to
Yes.
both, and thank you, Nancy, for accepting the invitation.
Yes, very much. Thank you, Nancy. I'm really
Okay.
appreciative.
Bye bye.
Thanks.